Some losses cut so deep, they change the very shape of your days. Eli Yoder knew this truth better than most after burying his wife and 3 children to fever. He'd spent 2 years moving through his Amish farm like a man walking underwater. One evening in 1898, a thin girl appeared at his gate with dirt under her fingernails and hunger in her eyes. She made him an offer that should have sounded foolish. "If I heal your lame horse, will you give me your leftovers?" Eli laughed, not from cruelty, but from the gentle surprise of it. Then his mare stood up and walked for the first time in months. In that moment, everything changed between a broken man and a lost child. They both carried wounds that ran deeper than anyone could see. Through shared meals and quiet conversations, they began to heal each other in ways neither expected. What happens when 2 people who've lost everything discover they might be exactly what the other needs? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of the Yoder farmhouse, casting long shadows across the worn pine table where Eli sat with his coffee growing cold. Hannah's unfinished wedding quilt lay folded on the chair beside him, the same chair where she used to sit and piece together the intricate star pattern while humming hymns in Pennsylvania Dutch. 2 years had passed since the fever took her and their children, yet Eli still set out an extra cup each morning before, remembering he would drink alone. The kitchen held the silence of a house that had forgotten how to be full. Every surface bore the careful attention of a man with too much time and too few reasons to use it well. The cast-iron stove gleamed black as midnight. The wooden counters bore no crumbs, and the dishes sat stacked in perfect order. It was the kind of cleanliness that spoke not of joy in keeping house, but of hours that needed filling and hands that needed work. Eli rose and moved to the window, watching the mist rise from the pasture where his horses grazed. The sight of them should have brought satisfaction. They were fine animals, well-bred and carefully tended, but even they reminded him of what he had lost. Little Samuel had loved the horses, would slip out before dawn to feed them handfuls of clover, his small hands gentle on their velvet noses. Rebecca had been learning to ride, her laughter ringing across the fields as she bounced in the saddle. And baby Mary, she had barely learned to walk before the fever claimed her, would never know the joy of a horse's steady gait beneath her dot at 52. Eli was still considered young by Amish standards, certainly young enough to remarry and start again. The widows in the community had made their interest known through carefully placed casseroles and lingering glances after Sunday service. Sarah Byler had lost her husband to a logging accident and had 3 young children who needed a father. Ruth Stoltzfus baked the finest Shoffley pie in Lancaster County and possessed the kind of steady competence that built strong households. Either would make a sensible match. Yet the thought of another woman's hands touching Hannah's things, of another woman's voice filling these rooms, left Eli feeling hollow as a rotted tree. The settlement of Cedar Creek stretched along the winding Pequea Creek, a collection of white farmhouses and red barns that had sheltered Amish families for 3 generations. Eli's grandfather had purchased this land in 1843, clearing the forests and building the sturdy stone foundation that still supported the house. The Yoder name carried weight here. His family had served as deacons and ministers, had mediated disputes and offered counsel in times of trouble. Even in his grief, neighbors still sought his wisdom, still brought their problems to his doorstep with the expectation that he would know what to do. But Eli felt as lost as any of them. He performed his duties as an elder, nodded at the right moments during church service, and offered what comfort he could to those who suffered. Inside, however, he wrestled with questions that felt too dangerous to speak aloud. If God was good, why had he taken his family? If prayer truly moved mountains, why had his desperate pleading fallen on deaf ears as his children burned with fever? The doubts gnawed at him like hunger, persistent and unwelcome. His daily routine had become a ritual of endurance. Up before dawn for morning prayers, though the words felt empty as autumn husks. Breakfast of eggs from his own hens, eaten standing at the counter because sitting at the table alone felt like admitting defeat. Then out to tend the animals, 3 draft horses, a small herd of cattle, and chickens that pecked around the yard with busy importance. The work was good, honest labor that demanded attention and left little room for brooding. Yet even the most absorbing tasks couldn't silence the questions that followed him like shadows. The community tried to help in the way of their people quietly, without fanfare or lengthy explanations. Jacob Stoltzfus had taken over much of Eli's fieldwork during the worst of his grief, appearing at dawn with his sons to plant and harvest as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Martha Byler brought fresh bread twice a week, leaving it on the porch with a gentle knock and no expectation of conversation. The kindnesses were real and deeply felt, yet they only emphasized how far he had drifted from the life he once knew. Sunday. Services at the Kaufman farm had become a particular trial. Eli would sit with the other men, watching the children fidget in their mother's laps, and feel as if he were observing life through thick glass. The familiar hymns, once a source of comfort, now sounded foreign to his ears. When Bishop Miller spoke of God's plan and the necessity of accepting his will, Eli found himself studying his hands instead of listening, noting every callus and scar as if they held answers the scriptures did not. The other widowers in the community seemed to manage their losses differently. Daniel Lapp had remarried within a year of his wife's passing, explaining matter-of-factly that his children needed a mother and his household needed order. Benjamin King threw himself into his carpentry work, crafting furniture with such intensity that he had more orders than he could fill. They had found ways to move forward, to rebuild, while Eli remained suspended in a place between grief and acceptance. His mare, Greta, had begun limping 3 weeks ago, an injury to her left foreleg. That refused to heal despite his careful tending. She was a sorrel with a white blaze down her face, gentle-natured and willing, the kind of horse that deserved better than the half-hearted attention he had been giving her. Each morning she would turn hopeful eyes toward him as he approached, with feed and fresh water, and each evening he would examine her leg with growing worry. The local veterinarian, an Englishman from Lancaster, had prescribed rest and liniment, but the limp persisted. The injury felt like another failure, one more thing slipping away despite his efforts. Greta had been Rebecca's favorite, the horse. His daughter had been learning to ride before the fever struck. Now she stood in the pasture, favoring her good legs, unable to run with the freedom that had once defined her. Eli saw something of himself in her careful movements, the way she protected her wounded places while still trying to function normally. Evening approached with the slow dignity of autumn in Pennsylvania. The maples along the fence line had begun their transformation, edges of scarlet creeping through the green like promises of the fire to come. Eli finished his chores with mechanical precision. Horses fed and watered. Cattle moved to fresh pasture. Chicken coops secured against foxes. The work provided rhythm if not purpose, structure for days that might otherwise dissolve into formless wandering dot. As he latched the barn door, something made him pause. The air held that particular quality of early autumn evenings, crisp enough to carry sound farther than usual. He could hear the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of leaves responding to a breeze that hadn't reached him yet, and something else, footsteps on the gravel lane that led to his farm. Visitors were common enough. The Amish community flowed in and out of each other's lives with easy familiarity. But these footsteps sounded different, lighter, more hesitant than those of his usual callers. Eli moved toward the front of the house, wiping his hands on his work clothes and wondering if Sarah Byler had decided to make another attempt at conversation. The thought filled him with weary resignation rather than anticipation. But when he rounded the corner of the house and saw the figure at his gate, every assumption fell away like shed skin. The girl couldn't have been more than 12 or 13, thin as a fence rail, with tangled brown hair that caught the last light of day. Her dress had once been blue, but dirt and wear had faded it to the color of winter sky. She stood perfectly still, watching him with eyes that seemed far too old for her narrow face. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Eli felt a strange recognition, as if he had been expecting her without knowing it. The girl's gaze never wavered, and in her stillness he sensed not fear but a kind of patient determination, like someone who had walked a long way to reach this particular gate at this particular moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the clarity of still water. "Are you the man with the lame horse?" she asked, and Eli felt something shift in the careful order of his world, subtle as the first crack in spring ice. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and watched as she placed one small, dirt-stained hand on the gate latch. In that gesture, he saw the end of one chapter of his life and the mysterious beginning of another, though he would not understand its significance until much later. The girl's next words would echo in his memory for years to come, simple and impossible in equal measure. "If I heal your horse, will you give me your leftovers?" Eli stared at the girl, certain he had misheard her words. The evening light played tricks sometimes, made sounds seem other than they were, but her expression remained steady and expectant. She clutched something small against her chest, a worn book bound in cracked leather that might once have been black. "Leftovers?" he repeated, the word feeling strange in his mouth. It had been so long since he'd had food remaining after meals that the concept seemed foreign. He cooked only what he needed, ate without enthusiasm, and cleaned his plate, from habit rather than hunger. The girl nodded solemnly. "Whatever you don't finish. Bread crusts, cold potatoes, maybe some milk if you have extra." Her voice held no shame, only the practical tone of someone accustomed to asking for what she needed. "I've been walking for 3 days, and my stomach's been talking louder than my prayers." Despite himself, Eli felt his mouth twitch, the ghost of what might have been a smile. It was the first time in months that anything had struck him as even mildly amusing. "And in exchange for my leftovers, you're offering to heal my horse?" "Yes, sir." She shifted the small book to one arm and pushed a strand of hair from her face with the back of her hand. "I know it sounds peculiar. Most folks think so when I make the offer, but your mare's hurting and I can help her." Eli glanced toward the pasture where Greta grazed apart from the other horses, her weight carefully distributed to favor her good legs. "What makes you think you can heal her when the veterinarian couldn't?" The girl was quiet for a long moment, her gaze following his to the injured mare. "Sometimes healing comes from places doctors don't learn about in their books. My grandmother taught me things before she passed. Said some folks are born with hands that remember what others forget." Something in her tone made Eli look more carefully at her face. She wasn't pretty in the conventional sense, too thin, too solemn, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of missed meals and uncertain shelter. But there was a quality about her that reminded him of deep water, still on the surface but moving with hidden currents beneath. "What's your name, child?" "Lita. May Brennan." She straightened her shoulders as she spoke, as if the name carried weight worth bearing. "I was born in Ohio, but I've been traveling since my grandmother died last spring. She said I'd know when I found the right place to stop. And when I saw your horse limping in that field, something inside me said this was it." Eli considered, her words turning them over in his mind like stones worn smooth by water. Everything about the situation should have prompted him to offer the girl a meal and directions to the nearest family willing to take in a wandering child. The Amish community had established procedures for such things. No one went hungry if it could be helped, and there were always families willing to provide temporary shelter in exchange for help with household tasks. Yet something held him back from following the expected path. Perhaps it was the way she had appeared at exactly the moment he was thinking about Greta's injury, or the confident certainty in her voice when she spoke of healing. More likely, it was the simple fact that she had managed to surprise him, too. Crack through the careful numbness that had become his default state. "You realize how this sounds," he said, though not unkindly. "A child appearing out of nowhere, claiming she can heal animals in exchange for table scraps?" Lita May nodded gravely. "I know it sounds like foolishness. That's why I always offer to prove it first. If I can't help your horse, you don't owe me anything. If I can, then maybe we both get what we need." The reasonableness of it struck him as almost funny. Here was a girl who couldn't be more than 13, negotiating like a traveling merchant with decades of experience. She had walked 3 days to reach his farm, carrying nothing but a worn Bible and whatever faith had convinced her this was where she belonged. "All right," Eli heard himself say, the words emerging before his practical mind could stop them. "Show me what you can do." Relief flickered across her features, subtle but unmistakable. She tucked the Bible more securely under her arm and unlatched the gate with the ease of someone accustomed to finding her own way. "Would you fetch her for me? Horses can sense when someone means to help, but she doesn't know me yet." Eli walked toward the pasture, aware of her following a few steps behind. His other horses, Buck and Sadie, raised their heads to watch the stranger, but showed no alarm. Animals were often better judges of character than people, and their calm acceptance of Lita May's presence registered somewhere in the back of his mind. Greta approached readily enough when he called, though her gait showed the careful placement of each step that had become familiar over the past weeks. She nuzzled his shoulder in greeting, then turned curious eyes toward the girl who stood quietly near the fence. "She's beautiful," Lita May said softly. "What happened to her leg?" "Best. I can tell. She stepped wrong in a gopher hole about 3 weeks back. Might have pulled something or bruised the bone. The veterinarian said rest and liniment, but she's not improving." Lita May approached the mare slowly, one hand extended palm up in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. Greta sniffed her fingers, then allowed the girl to stroke her neck. The sight of those small, dirt-stained hands moving gently along the horse's coat stirred something in Eli's chest, a memory of Rebecca doing the same thing, fearless in her affection for all creatures. "May I look at her leg?" Lita May asked, and when Eli nodded, she knelt beside the mare's injured limb. Her examination was thorough but gentle, fingers probing along the bone and joint with the kind of careful attention that spoke of real knowledge. "It's not broken," she said after a few minutes, "but there's heat trapped inside, like a bruise that can't heal because the blood isn't flowing right. Sometimes when injuries happen, the body tries so hard to protect the hurt place that it forgets how to let the healing in." She looked up at Eli with those 2 old eyes. "I need to place my hands on the injury and pray. It might seem strange to watch, but I promise I won't hurt her." Eli found himself nodding again, drawn along by her quiet confidence. He had seen many things in his 52 years, most of them explainable by common sense and practical knowledge. If this child had some folk remedy that might help Greta, what harm could it do? Lita May knelt again and placed both hands on the mare's injured leg, just above the swollen area. She closed her eyes and began to speak in a voice so low that Eli had to strain to catch the words. It wasn't Pennsylvania Dutch or English, but something older, syllables that seemed to rise from deep in her throat like water from a hidden spring. The mare stood perfectly still, as if she understood something important was happening. The evening air grew quiet around them. No bird calls, no rustle of leaves. Even the distant sounds of other farms seemed to fade. Eli felt his own breathing slow, drawn into the strange peace that had settled over the scene. Then Lita May's hands began to warm. At first, Eli thought it might be imagination or the last rays of sunlight playing tricks with his eyes. But the glow became unmistakable, a soft golden light that seemed to emanate from her palms and flow into the horse's injured leg. Greta nickered softly, a sound of contentment rather than pain. The light lasted perhaps a minute, maybe less. When it faded, Lita May opened her eyes and sat back on her heels, breathing heavily as if she had been running. "It's finished," she said simply. Eli stared at the mare's leg, seeing no obvious change. "How do we know if—" Greta took a step forward, placing her full weight on the previously injured limb. Then another step, and another. She walked in a small circle, her gait strong and even, showing none of the careful protection that had marked her movement for weeks. Eli's practical mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps the injury had been healing naturally, and this was simply the moment when improvement became visible. Maybe the mare had been favoring the leg more from habit than actual pain. There had to be some reasonable accounting for what he had just witnessed. But as he watched Greta break into a gentle trot, her hooves drumming against the earth with joyful rhythm, his skepticism crumbled like autumn leaves. Whatever had just happened, his horse was healed. He turned to look at Lita May, who was struggling to her feet with the tired movements of someone much older than her years. The effort had clearly cost her something, though she tried to hide it behind a small smile. "You kept your part of the bargain," she said. "Now I'm hoping you'll keep yours." Eli found his voice, though it sounded strange to his own ears. "Leftovers, you said, if you have any to spare." He looked at this thin, mysterious child who had just done the impossible with such casual competence that it seemed almost ordinary. Everything in his orderly world suggested he should be afraid, or at least deeply suspicious. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years, genuine curiosity about what might happen next. "I was about to start supper," he heard himself saying. "Would you prefer to eat leftovers, or would you consider sitting down to a proper meal?" The smile that spread across her face transformed it completely, revealing the child she truly was beneath all that careful composure. "A proper meal sounds like the finest thing I could imagine, Mr. Yoder." As they walked toward the house together, Eli caught sight of Hannah's unfinished quilt through the kitchen window and felt, for the first time since her death, that the empty spaces in his life might not be permanent after all. Behind them, Greta galloped across the pasture with the pure joy of a creature set free, and the sound of her hooves seemed to beat out the rhythm of possibilities yet to come. The carved wooden horse sat on the kitchen windowsill where it had remained untouched for 2 years, its simple lines worn smooth by Samuel's small hands before fever claimed him. Eli hadn't been able to put it away, but neither could he bear to look at it directly. Now, as he prepared supper with a guest at his table, the toy seemed to watch their movements with patient wooden eyes. Lita May sat perfectly straight in Hannah's chair, her warm Bible placed carefully beside her plate. She had washed her hands and face at the kitchen pump, revealing features that were sharper than he had first noticed. High cheekbones and a determined chin that spoke of stubbornness beneath her quiet manner. Her hair, clean of road dust, caught the lamplight with hints of auburn. "I can help with the cooking, if you'd like," she offered as Eli sliced bread from the loaf Martha Byler had brought that morning. "My grandmother taught me to make johnny cake and bean soup, and I'm fair hand at preserving vegetables." "Tonight you're a guest," Eli replied, surprised by how easily the words came. He hadn't shared a meal with anyone since last Christmas, when Jacob Stoltzfus had insisted he join their family gathering. "Tomorrow, if you're still here, we can discuss what work needs doing." The assumption that she might stay longer than one night had slipped out without conscious thought. Eli paused in his bread slicing, wondering when he had made that decision. The sensible thing would be to offer her a meal and a bed for the night, then help her find more permanent arrangements with a family better suited to caring for a young girl. The Byler widow had mentioned needing help with her younger children, And the Kaufman family often took in strays and orphans. But as he watched Lita May fold her hands and bow her head for silent grace, he found himself reluctant to speak of tomorrow's departures. She belonged in this kitchen in a way that defied explanation, as if she had been expected all along and was simply arriving on schedule. Supper was fried chicken with milk gravy, green beans from his garden, and fresh bread with butter. Simple fare, but more food than Eli usually prepared for himself. He found himself paying attention to the cooking in a way that had become foreign, considering how the chicken looked on the plate, whether the gravy was smooth enough, if the beans were properly seasoned. It had been a long time since his meals were meant to please anyone but himself. Lita May ate with the focused attention of someone who never took food for granted. She savored each bite, cleaning her plate thoroughly, but without the desperate haste of starvation. When she had finished, she folded her hands and looked directly at him with those disconcerting eyes. "Thank you for the finest meal I've had in months, Mr. Yoder." The chicken was perfectly fried, and that gravy could make a person weep with happiness. Her formal speech pattern struck him as unusual for a child her age, carrying an old-fashioned courtesy that suggested careful upbringing. "You're welcome to call me Eli, if you prefer. And you can tell me how you came to be wandering the roads of Pennsylvania by yourself." Something flickered across her face weariness, perhaps her old pain carefully controlled. "It's not much of a story. My grandmother raised me after my parents died of consumption when I was small. She had the healing gift, same as her mother, before her, and she taught me what she knew before her own time came. When she passed last spring, the neighbors wanted to send me to an orphanage in Cleveland, but I knew that wasn't where I belonged." "So you've been traveling alone since spring?" The thought of this child walking unknown roads for months made something clench in Ella's chest. "How did you eat? Where did you sleep?" "Folks are mostly kind, if you approach them right. I'd offer to heal their animals or help with chores in exchange for meals and barn space. Some gave more than they had to, and some turned me away, but I always found what I needed." She touched the Bible beside her plate. "Grandmother said the Lord looks after his own, and I found that to be true." Eli considered this philosophy, so simply stated yet requiring enormous faith to live by. In his darkest moments after Hannah's death, he had wondered if the Lord looked after anyone at all, or if they were all simply stumbling through life hoping for the best. To hear such certainty from a child who had lost everything seemed either naive or profoundly wise. "The healing you did with Greta," he said carefully, unsure how to frame his questions. "How long have you been able to do such things?" "Since I was little. Grandmother said I was born with the gift, but she made me promise never to use it for show or profit. Said that was how the devil turned good things wicked." Lita May's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Some folks think healing that doesn't come from a doctor must be witchcraft. We had to leave 2 towns because of talk like that." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Eli felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, the same rage he had experienced when whispers followed him after Hannah's death, suggestions that his family's suffering was somehow deserved, a punishment for some unnamed sin. People could be cruel in their fear, quick to judge what they didn't understand. "You won't face that kind of trouble here," he said firmly. "The Amish believe in God's healing power, even if we don't always understand how he chooses to work." Hope flickered in her eyes, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. "You really think I could stay, at least for a while?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications Eli wasn't prepared to examine. Taking in a stray child was no simple matter. There would be questions from the community, practical concerns about clothing and education, and the deeper issue of his own readiness to care for someone again. Yet, looking at her expectant face, he found those concerns mattered less than the strange sense of rightness that had settled over his kitchen. "We'll take it one day at a time," he said finally. Tomorrow I'll meet to speak with Bishop Miller about the arrangements, but I see no reason why you couldn't stay as long as you need to." The smile that lit her features was answer enough to his unspoken doubts. For the first time since his family's death, Eli felt the stirring of purpose beyond mere survival. This child needed what he could provide: shelter, protection, and perhaps, most importantly, someone willing to accept her unusual gift without fear or suspicion. After supper, Lita May insisted on helping with the dishes despite his protests. They worked together in comfortable quiet, her movements efficient and careful as she dried each plate and cup. The domestic routine felt both foreign and familiar, reminding him of evenings with Hannah while simultaneously creating something entirely new. "Where will I sleep?" she asked as they finished cleaning the kitchen. "I'm used to barns and haystacks, so anywhere dry and warm will seem like a palace." Eli considered his options. The house had 3 bedrooms upstairs, his own, the room that had belonged to the girls, and Samuel's smaller chamber. He hadn't entered either of the children's rooms since their deaths. Couldn't bear to see their clothes still hanging on pegs or their toys arranged on shelves. But Lita May couldn't sleep in the barn like a stray animal, and she deserved better than a makeshift bed in the kitchen. "There's a room upstairs that should suit you," he said, then hesitated. "It belonged to my son. I'll need a few minutes to make it ready." Understanding dawned in her eyes, along with a gentleness that seemed far too mature for her years. "Would you like me to help? Sometimes it's easier to face difficult things when you're not alone." The offer surprised him with its insight. She was right. The thought of entering Samuel's room by himself, of moving his son's belongings to make space for a stranger, felt overwhelming. But with Lita May beside him, it might be possible to see it as an act of healing rather than betrayal. "That would be helpful," he admitted, then led her up the narrow stairs to the 2nd floor. Samuel's room was exactly as he had left it, a small space under the eaves with a single window overlooking the barn. The bed was neatly made with one of Hannah's quilts, and his few toys were arranged on a shelf. Wooden animals Eli had carved, a spinning top, and several smooth stones collected from the creek. The sight of them hit harder than expected, and Eli found himself gripping the doorframe for support. Lita May moved quietly into the room, her gaze taking in the carefully preserved space. "He was loved," she said simply. "You can see it in how everything's been kept." "Samuel," Eli managed. "He was 7. The fever took him first, before we even knew how bad it would get." "What was he like?" The question caught him off guard. Most people avoided mentioning the children directly, as if speaking their names might cause him additional pain. But Lita May watched him with genuine interest, waiting for him to share if he chose. "Curious about everything," Eli found himself saying. "Always asking questions, always wanting to help with the farm work. He carved his own wooden horse before he was old enough to hold a knife properly." He gestured toward the windowsill downstairs. "I still have it. Would you tell me about the others too? Your daughters?" And somehow, standing in Samuel's room with this strange child who had healed his horse with light from her hands, Eli began to talk about Rebecca and Mary, about Hannah, about the life that had filled this house before silence claimed it. As he spoke, Lita May helped him gather Samuel's clothes and toys into a wooden chest, treating each item with the reverence due to precious relics. When they finished, the room felt different, not emptied, but prepared for new purpose. The essence of Samuel remained in the careful workmanship of the furniture and the love that had shaped every detail, but it no longer felt like a shrine to the dead. Instead, it seemed ready to shelter the living once again. "Thank you," Eli said as they made up the bed with fresh linens. "I couldn't have done this alone." Lita May nodded solemnly. Sometimes the hardest thing about letting go is doing it by yourself. But when someone helps carry the weight, it doesn't hurt quite as much. Her wisdom was unsettling in one so young, Yet Eli found comfort in her words. As he said goodnight and left her to settle in, he realized that for the first time in 2 years, he was looking forward to tomorrow morning. There would be someone else moving through his house, someone who might need his guidance and care. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Downstairs, he paused by the kitchen window and picked up Samuel's wooden horse, turning it over in his hands. The toy was warm from the lamplight, its simple curves as familiar as his own heartbeat. But instead of the usual sharp pang of loss, he felt something gentler memory touched with possibility. Grief beginning its slow transformation into something that might eventually resemble hope. The iron horseshoe hung above the barn door where Eli had placed it that morning, still warm from the forge where he'd shaped it to replace the one Greta had worn during her weeks of favoring her injured leg. The old shoe lay on his workbench, bent and worn thin from her careful stepping, a tangible reminder of how protection sometimes required bearing burdens unevenly. 3 days had passed since Lita May's arrival, and the rhythms of the farm had shifted to accommodate her presence in ways both subtle and profound. She rose before dawn without being asked, appearing in the kitchen as Eli prepared breakfast with the silent efficiency of someone accustomed to making herself useful. Her movements held the careful grace of a person who had learned early that survival often depended on anticipating needs before they were spoken. "The chickens are fed and watered," she reported, setting down the empty grain bucket by the kitchen door. "That red hen, the bossy one, tried to peck me again, but I convinced her we could be friends." Eli glanced up from the eggs he was scrambling, noting the small scratch on her knuckle that suggested the negotiation hadn't been entirely peaceful. Henrietta's always been territorial. "She thinks the whole co-op belongs to her by divine right. Grandmother used to say chickens were proof that pride comes in all sizes." Lita May washed her hands at the pump, then moved to slice bread for toast with movements that spoke of long practice in unfamiliar kitchens. She had a rooster named Napoleon who thought he was emperor of the barnyard until a fox taught him otherwise. Her stories of her grandmother came easily now, small glimpses into a life that seemed to have been rich in wisdom despite its material poverty. Eli found himself looking forward to these casual revelations, each one adding depth to his understanding of the girl who had appeared so mysteriously at his gate. After breakfast, they worked together on the morning chores with an ease that surprised him. Lita May had an instinctive understanding of farm work that went beyond her years, knowing when to approach the horses and when to give them space, understanding the moods of the cattle and the particular needs of each animal. She moved through the barn with quiet confidence, her small hands gentle but firm as she helped with milking and mucking stalls. "You've done this kind of work before," Eli observed as she expertly guided the last cow into the milking stall. "Some grandmother kept a milk cow and a few chickens, and I helped neighbors when they needed extra hands." She settled onto the milking stool with practiced ease. "Animals don't lie to you the way people sometimes do. They show you exactly what they're feeling, and they don't judge you for what you can or can't do." The truth of that observation settled between them as they worked. Eli had always found peace in the company of animals. Their honest needs and straightforward responses, a relief from the complexities of human interaction. Since Hannah's death, that preference had become even more pronounced. Animals didn't offer unwanted sympathy or ask uncomfortable questions about his faith. As the morning progressed toward afternoon, Jacob Stoltzfus appeared in the farmyard with his youngest son Daniel trailing behind him. Jacob was Eli's closest neighbor and oldest friend, a man whose steady presence had been a source of comfort during the darkest days after the fever. But today his weathered face carried an expression of barely contained curiosity that made Eli's stomach tighten with apprehension. "I heard you had a visitor," Jacob said without preamble, his eyes scanning the barn where Lita May was finishing her work with the cows. Martha Byler mentioned seeing smoke from your chimney at unusual hours, and young Thomas Kaufman swore he saw a girl working in your fields yesterday morning. Eli had been expecting this conversation since Lita May's arrival. News traveled fast in the close-knit community, and a strange child living at the home of a grieving widower was bound to generate talk. She's helping with the farm work in exchange for room and board. Nothing improper about the arrangement. Never said there was. Jacob's tone was mild, but his gaze remained sharp. Just wondering about her people. Where she came from, how long. She's planning to stay. You know how folks worry about unknown quantities. Before Eli could respond, Lita May emerged from the barn carrying a bucket of fresh milk. She had braided her hair that morning and wore one of Hannah's old work dresses, altered to fit her smaller frame. The transformation was remarkable. Instead of the ragged waif who had appeared at his gate, she looked like any Amish girl helping with household duties. "Mr. Stoltzfus," she said with a polite nod, setting down the milk bucket and wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Lita May Brennan. Pleased to make your acquaintance." Jacob studied her with the careful attention of a man evaluating livestock. At market, "Jacob Stoltzfus, this is my boy Daniel." He gestured to the 10-year-old, who stood half-hidden behind his father, wide-eyed with curiosity about the mysterious stranger. "Hello, Daniel," Lita May said warmly. "Would you like to meet the horses? There's a new colt that loves having his nose scratched." The boy looked to his father for permission, received a slight nod, and followed Lita May toward the pasture fence. Eli watched them go, noting how easily she had redirected the conversation away from uncomfortable questions about her background. "She's got good manners," Jacob admitted, though his tone remained cautious. "Speaks like she's been properly raised. But that doesn't answer my questions about where she came from or why she's traveling alone." Eli chose his words carefully. "She lost her grandmother this spring and has been looking for a place to settle. I offered her temporary shelter while she decides what to do next." Temporary. Jacob repeated the word as if testing its weight. And what does Bishop Miller think of this temporary arrangement? A question hit its mark. Eli had been avoiding that particular conversation, partly from reluctance to face official scrutiny and partly from uncertainty about his own intentions. The truth was, he hadn't yet spoken to the bishop about Lita May's presence, though he knew such a discussion was inevitable. "I plan to call on him this afternoon," Eli said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. Jacob nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than disapproving. "Might be wise. You know, there's already talk about the propriety of a single man housing a young girl, no matter how innocent the circumstances. Best to have the church's blessing before the gossip gets out of hand." The warning was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of a friend offering practical advice, but it carried the weight of genuine concern. Eli appreciated Jacob's directness, even as it confirmed his own growing worry about community reaction. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Lita May and Daniel at the fence line. The girl was explaining something about horse behavior, her voice carrying clearly across the yard as she demonstrated the proper way to approach Greta. The mare, fully recovered from her injury, nuzzled Lita May's hand with obvious affection. "That's the horse that was lame last week," Daniel called to his father, excitement clear in his voice. "But look how well she moves now." Jacob's eyebrows rose slightly. "Lame horse?" "Greta pulled something a few weeks back," Eli explained, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "She's healing up well." "Healing up or healed?" Jacob's question was sharp with interest. "Because young Daniel's right, she looks sound as a bell." Eli found himself caught between honesty and the knowledge that the truth would only raise more questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Sometimes injuries heal faster than expected. Jacob studied him for a long moment, clearly sensing there was more to the story. But before he could press further, Lita May returned with Daniel, who was chattering enthusiastically about everything he'd learned about horses in the past 10 minutes. "She knows more about animals than most grown folks," Daniel announced to his father. Said she can tell what they're thinking just by watching their ears and eyes. "Is that so?" Jacob's gaze shifted between Lita May and Eli, speculation clear in his expression. "Sounds like a useful skill. My grandmother taught me to pay attention," Lita May said simply. "Animals tell you things if you know how to listen." As the Stoltzfus family prepared to leave, Jacob pulled Eli aside for a final word. "She seems like a good girl, and Lord knows you could use the company. But be careful, old friend. The community's already watching this situation closely, and there are some who'd be happy to find fault with your choices." The warning lingered in Eli's mind as he watched them walk away. He knew Jacob was right. There would be those who questioned his decision to take in a strange girl, especially one whose background remained largely mysterious. The Amish community valued stability and proper procedure, and his spontaneous act of charity could easily be seen as reckless or inappropriate. That afternoon, as promised, he made the trip to Bishop Miller's farm. The conversation was every bit as uncomfortable as he'd anticipated, filled with probing questions about Lita May's origins and pointed reminders about the appearance of impropriety. But the bishop was also a practical man who understood the reality of Christian charity, and in the end, he gave provisional approval for the arrangement with the understanding that it would be reviewed regularly. "The girl will need proper clothing and instruction in our ways if she's to remain among us," Bishop Miller concluded. "And there must be no hint of scandal. The community's reputation depends on maintaining the highest standards of moral conduct." Eli agreed to all conditions, relief flooding through him as he realized Lita May could stay, at least for now. But as he drove home through the gathering dusk, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger conversation. The community's acceptance would not come easily, and there were still too many unanswered questions about the girl, who had healed his horse with light from her hands. When he reached the farm, he found Lita May sitting on the front porch with her warm Bible in her lap, watching the road as if she'd been waiting for his return. The sight of her there, small and solitary, but somehow belonging, filled him with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "How did it go?" she asked as he climbed the porch steps. "You can stay," he said simply, and watched relief transform her features, like sunrise breaking over still water that night. As they shared another quiet supper, Eli found himself studying the iron horseshoe above the barn door through the kitchen window. It represented protection and good fortune in folk tradition, but to him it had become something more, a symbol of how sometimes the greatest strength came from learning to bear weight differently, from finding new ways to move forward when the old paths no longer served. Outside, Greta grazed peacefully in the pasture, her gait strong and sure, carrying no trace of her former injury. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and fresh questions from curious neighbors. But tonight there was simply this: a shared meal, quiet conversation, and the comfortable presence of someone who had somehow become necessary to the proper functioning of his world. The cracked hand mirror lay face down in Lita May's small traveling bundle, the only possession she had carried from her grandmother's house. Eli discovered it by accident while helping her organize her few belongings in Samuel's old dresser, the broken glass catching lamplight and throwing fractured reflections across the bedroom wall. When he asked about it, her face closed like a door swinging shut. "It was my mother's," she said quietly, wrapping the damaged mirror in a piece of soft cloth. "Grandmother kept it after the consumption took her. Said I should have something to remember her by, even if it wasn't much to look at anymore." The mirror's spider web of cracks seemed to tell a story of careful preservation despite hardship, of something precious protected even when it could no longer serve its intended purpose. Eli understood that kind of keeping, hadn't he maintained? Hannah's sewing corner exactly as she'd left it, her thimble still resting beside half-finished mending. 2 weeks had passed since Bishop Miller's conditional approval, and the community's initial curiosity had settled into something more complex, a mixture of acceptance and watchful concern that followed them like morning shadows. Sunday services had become exercises in careful navigation, with Lita May sitting beside him in the women's section, while conversation swirled around them in Pennsylvania, Dutch too rapid for her to follow. The girl had adapted to Amish customs with remarkable ease, trading her worn traveling dress for properly plain clothing sewn by the generous hands of Martha Byler and Ruth Stoltzfus. Her hair was now covered by a simple white cap, and she had mastered the art of keeping her eyes downcast during worship while somehow still absorbing every detail of the proceedings. Yet beneath the surface conformity, Eli sensed the same watchful distance that marked her cracked mirror present but protecting something fragile at its core. "She dreams in voices," Eli confided to Jacob Stoltzfus one evening as they mended fence posts together. "I hear her talking in her sleep sometimes, but not in English or Pennsylvania Dutch. Something older, like what she spoke when she healed. Greta." Jacob paused in his hammering, considering this information with the careful attention he gave to all matters touching on the spiritual realm. Dreams can be messages, or they can just be the mind working through what it can't understand. While awake. "Does she remember what she says?" "I've never asked." Eli positioned another post, testing its stability before Jacob drove it home with them all. "Seems like something too private to pry into, unless she chooses to share it. Might be wise to listen more carefully," Jacob suggested, his tone carrying the weight of friendly concern. Sarah Byler mentioned that her youngest daughter had nightmares for a week after Lita May helped deliver a difficult calf. Said the child kept talking about bright lights and angels speaking in tongues. The information struck Eli like a physical blow. He had known about Lita May's help with the Byler cattle. She had asked permission to assist when word came that a heifer was struggling with her first birth. What he hadn't known was that her intervention had affected others beyond the immediate situation. "The calf lived," Jacob continued, driving another post with perhaps more force than necessary. "Born healthy after hours of struggle that should have killed both mother and baby. Sarah was grateful, but she's worried about the influence on her children. Says they keep asking questions about miracles and healing that she doesn't know how to answer." Eli felt the familiar weight of community judgment settling on his shoulders like winter wool, warm enough to protect, but heavy enough to restrict movement. Every act of kindness from Lita May, every small healing or moment of unexplained grace, seemed to generate fresh concerns about her influence on impressionable minds. That evening, he found himself watching her more carefully as she prepared supper. Her movements in the kitchen had become as natural as breathing, reaching for seasonings without looking, adjusting the stove's heat with unconscious precision, timing multiple dishes to finish simultaneously. She had transformed his sparse bachelor cooking into proper meals that filled the house with warmth and purpose. "You've been quiet today," she observed, glancing up from the potatoes she was mashing. "Did something happen during your work with Mr. Stoltzfus?" Her perceptiveness continued to surprise him. She seemed to read emotions the way others read weather signs, catching subtle shifts in mood or atmosphere that most people missed entirely. It was a useful gift, but one that made keeping secrets nearly impossible. "People are talking," he said carefully, unsure how much to share. "About your healing abilities, about the effect you have on children who witness them." Lita May's hands stilled on the masher, though she didn't look up from her work. "What kind of talk?" "Concerned that you might be influencing the children in ways their parents don't understand. Fear that your gifts come from sources they can't recognize or approve." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft bubbling of beans on the stove and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. When Lita May finally spoke, her voice carried a weariness that seemed far too old for her years. "It's always the same," she said quietly. "First, they want the healing for their animals, their crops, their family members who suffer. Then, when the healing comes, they start to fear what made it possible. They'd rather have their loved ones remain sick than accept help from something they can't control or understand." Eli heard the pain beneath her matter-of-fact tone, the accumulated weight of rejection and suspicion that had driven her from place to place. "It's not that simple here. These are good people who want to do right by both you and their own children. They're just afraid of leading their families astray. And what do you think?" The question came quietly, but he heard the vulnerability beneath it. "Do you believe my gifts come from God or from somewhere darker?" The question hung between them like morning mist, substantial enough to feel but too delicate to grasp directly. Eli found himself studying her face in the lamplight, the serious eyes, the mouth that rarely smiled but held kindness at its corners, the overall impression of someone carrying burdens too heavy for her size. "I think," he said slowly, "that good fruit grows on good trees. I've watched you for 2 weeks now, seen how you treat every living creature with gentleness and respect. You pray over your meals, read your Bible each night, and show more Christian charity than most adults. No, if God didn't approve of your gifts, I doubt he'd let you use them to ease suffering." Relief flickered across her features, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. "My grandmother used to say that the devil can't create anything, only twist what God has made. She taught me to test every healing with prayer, to make sure it comes from a place of love rather than pride or anger." "And how do you test it?" Lita May considered the question, absently resuming her work with the potatoes. "There's a feeling when the healing is right, like warm water flowing through your hands, carrying peace along with it. When it's wrong, the power feels cold and grasping, like it wants something in return. I've learned to wait until I feel that warmth before I touch anyone or anything." Her explanation carried the ring of hard-won wisdom, the kind that came from careful observation and painful experience. Eli found himself wondering what failures had taught her to recognize the difference between healing and its darker counterfeits. As they sat down to supper, the conversation turned to lighter matters, the progress of the late garden, plans for preserving vegetables before the first frost, the amusing antics of the barn cats who had appointed themselves guardians of the grain stores. But underneath the domestic normalcy, Eli sensed a new tension in Lita May's posture, a wariness that hadn't been there before. After the dishes were cleaned and put away, she excused herself to read in her room, taking her warm Bible and the mended lamp that had become her nightly companions. Eli remained at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold and wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. How much community resistance could he weather for the sake of keeping her safe? What would happen if her healing gifts became too visible, too undeniable for even the most charitable interpretation to explain away? And perhaps most troubling, what if the whispers of supernatural influence eventually reached the ears of those outside their close-knit community, drawing the kind of attention that could endanger them both? Through the window, he could see the iron horseshoe above the barn door, black against the star-filled sky. Protection and good fortune, the old beliefs claimed, but some burdens required more than folk wisdom to bear safely. Some challenges demanded choices that tested everything a person thought they knew about faith, community, and the price of doing what seemed right. Upstairs, he could hear the soft murmur of Lita May's voice as she read aloud from Scripture, the words too faint to distinguish, but the rhythm as familiar as breathing. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever decisions lay ahead, tonight there was still this, the simple piece of Scripture read by lamplight, the comfort of another soul seeking guidance from the same source that had sustained his family for generations. Outside, the autumn winds stirred the leaves with promises of winter to come, but inside the house remained warm and steady, sheltered by more than stone and timber. They would face whatever challenges arose together, he decided, whatever the cost to his standing in the community or his own peace of mind. Some things were worth protecting, even when protection required courage he wasn't sure he possessed. The dried wildflower bouquet hung from the kitchen rafters, its colors faded but somehow more beautiful in their autumn transformation purple. Asters gone lavender soft, goldenrod bleached to pale yellow, and Queen Anne's lace that had turned the color of old ivory. Leda May had gathered them during one of their evening walks through the far pasture, her hands moving with unconscious grace as she selected each stem for reasons only she understood. "They're prettier dried than fresh," she had explained when Eli questioned the wisdom of picking flowers already past their prime. "Fresh blooms are lovely, but they're still changing, still becoming what they're meant to be. Dried flowers have reached their final form. They've given up the possibility of more growth in exchange for lasting beauty." The observation had stayed with him through the weeks that followed, as autumn deepened into serious preparation for winter and their own relationships settled into patterns that felt both new and eternal. October had brought the kind of perfect weather that made farmers grateful for their calling crisp mornings that gave way to warm afternoons, with skies so blue they seemed painted against the changing foliage. Leda May had been with him for 6 weeks now, long enough for her presence to feel essential rather than temporary. She had developed friendships with some of the community children, particularly young Daniel Stoltzfus, who had appointed himself her devoted follower and student in all matters relating to animal care. The boy arrived most afternoons to help with chores, his enthusiasm infectious as Leda May taught him to read the subtle signs that indicated when livestock were content, anxious, or unwell. "Watch Bessie's ears," she instructed as they approached the milk cow one evening. "See how they're tilted forward. That means she's alert but not worried. If they were laid back flat, we'd know to be more careful around her." Daniel absorbed every word with the intense concentration of youth discovering new worlds of knowledge. "How do you know all this? Did your grandmother teach you about animals too?" "Some of it came from her, some from just paying attention." Leda May's hands moved gently along Bessie's flank, checking for any signs of discomfort or injury. Animals don't lie about their feelings the way people sometimes do. They show you exactly what's true. Eli, listening from the barn doorway, found himself wondering if that observation applied to humans as well. Certainly, Leda May seemed incapable of deception, her emotions playing across her face with the transparent honesty that Daniel had noted in the animals she tended. When she was happy, her entire being seemed to glow with contentment. When worry clouded her features, it was impossible to ignore or dismiss. Lately, she had been carrying more worry than usual. The initial acceptance of her presence in the community had given way to a more complex dynamic as her unusual abilities became harder to ignore or explain away. 3 times in the past month, neighbors had sought her help with sick animals, and each successful healing had generated fresh rounds of whispered speculation about the source of her gifts. The most recent incident had involved Benjamin King's prize bull, a massive creature that had somehow managed to impale itself on a broken fence post. The injury should have been fatal. Certainly the local veterinarian had been pessimistic about the animal's chances for survival. But after Leda May spent an hour in prayer over the wounded beast, the bull had recovered with remarkable speed, showing no signs of infection or lasting damage. "It's becoming too visible," Eli had confided to Martha Byler when she stopped by with fresh bread and barely concealed curiosity about the miracle healing everyone was discussing. "People are starting to seek her out specifically for healings, and that's not healthy for anyone involved." Martha's response had been characteristically direct. "The girl has a gift, that much is obvious. The question is whether she can learn to use it wisely, or if it will become a burden that drives her away from yet another community." The warning had been delivered with kindness, but it carried the weight of genuine concern. Martha had seen too many gifted individuals struggle with the expectations and fears their abilities generated. Some learned to hide their talents, while others were eventually forced to leave communities that couldn't accommodate their differences. That evening, as Lita May helped prepare supper with her usual quiet efficiency, Eli decided it was time to address the growing tension directly. "We need to talk about what happened with Benjamin's bull," he said, watching her hands still on the vegetables she was chopping. "I know." Her voice was steady, but he caught the subtle tightening around her eyes that indicated worry. "People are starting to expect miracles, and that's never good for anyone involved." "What do you mean?" Lita May set down her knife and turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "When folks start thinking you can fix everything that's broken, they stop taking responsibility for their own choices. They expect healing without changing the conditions that caused the sickness in the first place. And when you can't heal everything because no one can, they turn angry and resentful." Her insight surprised him with its maturity. "Is that what happened in the other places you lived?" "Twice, once in Ohio and again in western Pennsylvania. Both times started the same way, a few small healings that people noticed, then word spreading until strangers were arriving from neighboring towns expecting miracles on demand." She picked up the knife again, but her movements lacked their usual grace. "When I couldn't heal a child with consumption, they decided my gifts must be false. When I couldn't save a farmer's wife from childbed fever, they accused me of withholding my power out of spite." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Eli felt anger rise in his chest at the thought of communities turning on a child who had tried to help them. "What did you do?" "Left, both times." Grandmother said it was better to move on than to stay where fear had poisoned the well of trust. Lita May resumed her chopping with mechanical precision. She was probably right, but it's hard to keep starting over, to keep hoping the next place will be different. "This place is different," Eli said firmly, though even as he spoke the words he wondered if they were true. "The people here have known you for weeks now. They've seen your character, not just your gifts." Lita May's smile held more sadness than hope. "People can know your character and still turn against you when fear takes hold. It's not about being good or bad. It's about feeling safe, and unusual abilities make some folks feel very unsafe." Her wisdom was hard-earned and painful to hear. Yet Eli found himself reluctant to accept the possibility that their community might eventually reject someone who had brought such unexpected joy to his life. The past 6 weeks had transformed his daily existence from mere survival to something approaching contentment. Meals were shared conversations rather than solitary ordeals. Evening chores became opportunities for teaching and learning. Even his prayers felt more authentic with another voice joining his own in quiet gratitude. "What if we could find a way to use your gifts more quietly?" he suggested. "Help those who truly need it without drawing attention from the entire county." I've tried that before. Healing has a way of making itself known, no matter how carefully you try to hide it. Animals recover when they shouldn't. Injuries disappear overnight. And people notice these things whether you want them to or not. She moved to the stove to check on the pot of soup simmering there, her movements carrying the careful control of someone managing deep emotion. "Maybe it would be better if I moved on before the situation becomes uncomfortable for you." The suggestion hit him like a physical blow. The thought of returning to his former isolation, of eating meals alone, and working through chores without her quiet company felt unbearable. Yet he also understood the practical wisdom behind her words. If her presence eventually brought controversy or danger to their peaceful community, staying might be an act of selfishness rather than charity. "I don't want you to leave," he said, quietly, surprised by the intensity of his own emotion. "This place, this life, it's better with you in it." I'm better with you in it." Lita May turned from the stove to study his face, her expression unreadable. "Even if it means facing questions and suspicion from your neighbors. Even if some people decide you've made a mistake by sheltering me. Even then." The certainty in his voice surprised them both. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together. That's what families do." The word hung between them, family spoken, without conscious thought, but carrying the weight of truth. Somewhere in the past 6 weeks, this thin girl with her mysterious gifts and gentle wisdom had stopped being a temporary guest and had become something essential to his understanding of home. Tears gathered in her eyes, quickly blinked away, but unmistakable in their intensity. "I've never had anyone say that to me before. Not since grandmother died." "Well, you have someone saying it now." Eli moved to the window and looked out at the darkening farmyard, where the dried wildflowers swayed gently in the evening breeze. "And tomorrow, whatever challenges it brings, we'll meet them as a family should together." That night, as they shared another quiet supper, and the conversation turned to plans for the coming week, Eli found himself looking at the preserved bouquet with new understanding. Like the flowers Lita May had chosen, the relationship had moved beyond the fresh uncertainty of new growth into something more permanent and lasting. They had given up the possibility of returning to their former separate existences in exchange for the deeper beauty of shared purpose and mutual belonging. Outside, the autumn wind carried the promise of winter's approach, but inside their home remained warm and steady, sustained by more than fire and food. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them with the strength that came from choosing to remain together when leaving would have been easier. The dried flowers stirred gently in the lamplight, their faded colors somehow more beautiful for having endured the transformation from fresh bloom to lasting memorial. Like hope itself, they had survived the dying of their original form to become something altogether different, fragile perhaps, but possessed of an endurance that fresh beauty could never match. The faded photograph arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, carried by a stranger whose buggy bore the dust of many miles and whose eyes held the weight of unwelcome news. Eli found it tucked inside an envelope addressed to the Amish elder housing Lita May Brennan. The handwriting careful but unfamiliar, the paper bearing the return address of a law office in Columbus, Ohio. The man who delivered it introduced himself as Thomas Hartwell, a lawyer's clerk tasked with locating a missing child on behalf of her surviving relatives. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the pale complexion of someone who spent his days indoors poring over legal documents, and his nervous manner suggested he was as uncomfortable with his errand as Eli was receiving it. "I was told the girl might be found here," Hartwell explained, refusing Eli's offer of coffee, but accepting a seat at the kitchen table. "There are family members who have been searching for her since her grandmother's death last spring. They have concerns about her welfare and her legal status as an unaccompanied minor." Eli felt something cold settle in his stomach as he examined the envelope's contents. Along with several official-looking documents was a photograph that made his breath catch in his throat. The image showed a family of 4 posed stiffly before a photographer's backdrop, a man and woman with 2 children. A girl of perhaps 5 or 6 and a younger boy who couldn't have been more than 3. The girl in the photograph was unmistakably Lita May, though years younger and wearing the kind of elaborate dress that spoke of prosperity, rather than the simple poverty she had described. Her hair was arranged in careful ringlets, and her expression held none of the careful wariness he had come to associate with her features. She looked, quite simply, like a child from a well-to-do family posing for a formal portrait. "This doesn't make sense," Eli said, studying the photograph more carefully. "Lita May told me her parents died of consumption when she was small and that she was raised by her grandmother in modest circumstances." Hartwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than she may have led you to believe. According to our records, Lida Mae Brennan is the daughter of Jonathan and Elizabeth Brennan of Youngstown, Ohio. Her father owned a successful grain mill, and the family was quite prosperous until tragedy struck. The lawyer's clerk reached into his satchel and withdrew another document, this one bearing an official seal and the solemn weight of legal authority. There was a fire at the family mill in 1889. Jonathan Brennan was killed in the blaze, and his wife died from smoke inhalation 3 days later. The children Lida Mae and her younger brother Samuel were taken in by their paternal grandmother, Mrs. Catherine Brennan. Eli's mind reeled at the information, trying to reconcile this version of events with everything Lida Mae had told him about her past. The detail about her brother sharing his own son's name felt like a cruel coincidence, yet the official documents seemed genuine enough. What happened to the brother? He asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Hartwell's expression grew even more somber. Samuel Brennan died of scarlet fever 2 years after the fire. The grandmother, Catherine Brennan, passed away this past spring, leaving Lida Mae with no immediate family. However, she does have relatives, an uncle and aunt in Cincinnati who have been searching for her since her disappearance from the grandmother's funeral. Disappearance? The word tasted bitter in Eli's mouth. She didn't disappear. She left because the neighbors wanted to send her to an orphanage. That single quote's not accurate. Hartwell consulted his papers again, clearly uncomfortable with contradicting. His host, the uncle, Thomas Brennan, had already arranged to take custody of his niece. He traveled to Ohio for the funeral, specifically to bring her home to Cincinnati, where she would have been provided with proper schooling, housing, and care appropriate to her station. The foundation of everything Eli thought he knew about Lida Mae began to crumble like sand beneath his feet. If these documents were accurate, she was not the poor orphan she had presented herself as, but the heir to a substantial inheritance who had run away from family members trying to care for her. There's more, Hartwell continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The uncle has reported some unusual circumstances surrounding his niece's abilities. Apparently, she demonstrated certain healing powers during her time with the grandmother, powers that drew unwanted attention from local authorities and religious leaders who questioned their source. Eli's blood ran cold. What kind of attention? There was an investigation by church officials in Youngstown after reports that the girl had performed what some called miraculous healings. The matter was dropped after the grandmother's death, but it's part of the reason the uncle is so concerned about locating her. He fears she may be vulnerable to those who would exploit her abilities or, worse, those who might consider them unnatural. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a poisoned fire. Eli had heard whispered stories of gifted individuals who had faced accusations of witchcraft or demonic influence, usually ending in exile or worse. The thought that Lida Mae might be fleeing not just poverty but actual persecution made his chest tighten with protective fury. What does the uncle want? Eli asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. He wants her returned to his custody immediately. He's prepared to provide proper compensation for her care during her absence, and he's even willing to overlook the irregularities of her current living situation if she's returned without further delay. Hartwell reached into his satchel one final time and produced a legal document that bore the imposing weight of official authority. This is a writ of custody, signed by a judge in Cincinnati. It gives Thomas Brennan legal authority to reclaim his niece and transport her back to Ohio for her own protection and welfare. Eli stared at the document, its formal language and official seals making his kitchen suddenly feel like foreign territory. Everything he had built with Lida Mae over the past 2 months, the shared meals, the quiet conversations, the growing sense of family could be swept away by a piece of paper and the determination of relatives who had never bothered to understand what she truly needed. When? he asked, the word coming out rougher than intended. Mr. Brennan is prepared to travel here within the week to collect her personally. He understands this may be ... difficult for all parties involved, but he's convinced it's in her best interest to be with family rather than strangers, however well-intentioned. As if summoned by the gravity of the conversation, the kitchen door opened and Lita May entered, her cheeks pink from the cold November air and her arms full of eggs from the morning gathering. She stopped short when she saw the stranger at their table, her gaze moving quickly from Hartwell to Eli to the papers scattered between them. The moment her eyes fell on the photograph, every trace of color drained from her face. The basket of eggs slipped from her nerveless fingers, shells cracking against the wooden floor as she stared at the image of her younger self, surrounded by family members she had tried so hard to forget. "You found me," she said quietly, her voice carrying neither surprise nor relief, only the weary resignation of someone who had always known this moment would come. Hartwell stood, his official demeanor softening slightly as he took in her obvious distress. "Miss Brennan, I'm Thomas Hartwell, representing your uncle's legal interests. He's been very worried about you and wants to bring you home where you belong." Lita May's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "Home? Is that what he calls it? Your uncle has provided a good life for his own children," Hartwell continued, clearly following a prepared script. "You would have your own room, proper schooling, and all the advantages befitting a young lady of your social standing. Surely that's preferable to..." He gestured vaguely around the simple kitchen, clearly at a loss for how to politely describe her current circumstances. "To being loved for who I am rather than what I might inherit." Lita May's voice carried a steel that Eli had never heard before. "To being accepted for my gifts rather than feared for them? To finally finding a place where I belong?" She moved to Eli's side, her small hand finding his shoulder with the naturalness of long habit. "Mr. Hartwell, I appreciate that my uncle is concerned about my welfare, but I'm exactly where I need to be, with the family I've chosen and who have chosen me in return." Hartwell looked genuinely distressed by her response. "Miss Brennan, I understand your attachment to these kind people, but you must understand that your uncle has legal authority over your welfare. This isn't a matter of preference, it's a matter of law." The photograph lay on the table between them, that image of a prosperous family frozen in time before tragedy transformed their lives forever. Eli stared at it, seeing not just Lita May's hidden past, but the future that threatened to tear her away from the only stability she had known since her world fell apart. "How long do we have?" he asked quietly, already knowing the fight was lost before it began. "Mr. Brennan will arrive on Friday," Hartwell replied, gathering his papers with the efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "I understand this is difficult, but he truly believes he's acting in her best interests." After the lawyer's clerk departed, leaving behind only the photograph and the echoes of unwelcome revelations, Eli and Lita May sat in silence amid the broken eggshells scattered across their kitchen floor. The image of her younger self seemed to mock them both, evidence of a life she had tried to leave behind, and a claim that might prove stronger than the bonds they had forged through choice rather than blood. "Is any of it true?" Eli asked finally. "What you told me about your past?" Lita May picked up one of the unbroken eggs, turning it over in her hands as if it might contain answers to questions too painful to voice directly. "The important parts are true. My parents did die when I was young, not from consumption, but in the fire he mentioned. My brother Samuel did die of fever, and my grandmother did raise me and teach me about healing before she passed." She set the egg down carefully, as if it were made of the finest china. "But you're right to feel deceived. I let you believe we were poor because it was easier than explaining why a girl with inheritance money would choose to wander the roads alone. I let you think I had no family because it was simpler than admitting I was running from people who claimed to love me, but Wanted to change everything that made me who I am.
And your uncle? What's he really like?
The shadows that crossed her features told Eli everything he needed to know before she spoke a single word. He's not cruel, exactly. But he sees my gifts as something shameful that needs to be hidden or, better yet, eliminated entirely. He spent 3 months after grandmother's funeral trying to convince me that my healing abilities were either imagination or something worse. He wanted to send me to doctors who specialized in treating children with unusual behaviors. The picture became clearer now, and with clarity came a rage that surprised Eli with its intensity. Thomas Brennan wasn't trying to rescue his niece. He was trying to reclaim property that had embarrassed him by running away. Worse, he intended to drag her back to a life that would systematically destroy everything that made her unique and valuable. "We'll fight this," Eli said, surprised by the steel in his own voice. "There must be legal ways to contest custody, especially if we can prove he's not acting in your best interests." Lita May shook her head sadly. "You don't understand how this works. I'm a child with no legal standing, and he's my closest living relative with both money and social position. No court will side with an Amish farmer over a respectable businessman, especially when that businessman can present himself as rescuing his wayward niece from an inappropriate living situation." The truth of her words hit like cold water. Eli's growing reputation in the community meant nothing beyond the boundaries of their small Amish settlement. In the larger world of legal documents and official authority, he was exactly what Hartwell had implied, a well-meaning stranger with no legitimate claim to the girl he had come to love outside. The November wind rattled the windows with increasing intensity, carrying the promise of winter's approach. Inside, the photograph lay on the table like an indictment, evidence of secrets kept and trust betrayed, but also of the larger forces that threatened to tear apart the fragile family they had built from shared grief and unexpected grace. Friday was only 3 days away. Eli's prayer book lay open on his nightstand, its pages marked with decades of questioning and seeking, the margins filled with penciled notes that tracked his spiritual journey through seasons of faith and doubt. Tonight, as he knelt beside his bed in the pre-dawn darkness of Thursday morning, the familiar words felt both foreign and essential, like a half-remembered language that might still hold the power to save what mattered most. Tomorrow, Thomas Brennan would arrive to claim his niece, armed with legal documents and the unshakable conviction that blood ties trump bonds of choice and love. Eli had spent the past 2 days exploring every possible avenue of resistance, consulting with Bishop Miller about the church's authority in such matters, writing to Lancaster to speak with a lawyer about challenging the custody order, even considering the desperate option of helping Lita May disappear before her uncle could reach them. Each path had led to the same conclusion. The law was clear, and their position was hopeless. A successful businessman with proper family credentials would always prevail over an Amish farmer with no legal standing, regardless of the child's own wishes or best interests. The system was designed to protect property rights and family authority, not the intangible bonds that grew between souls who found healing in each other's presence. "Lord," Eli whispered into the darkness, his voice barely audible above the November wind that rattled the farmhouse walls. "I've asked for so little. These past years, carried my grief without complaint, accepted your will, even when it made no sense to my human understanding. But this child, she's brought light back into this house, purpose back into my days. If there's a way to keep her safe, to protect what we've built together, please show me what it is." The prayer felt both desperate and familiar, echoing the countless nights he had pleaded for his family's recovery from fever, for some divine intervention that never came. Yet something was different this time. Instead of the hollow echo of words spoken into an empty sky, he sensed something listening, weighing, perhaps preparing to respond in ways he couldn't yet understand. Downstairs, he could hear the soft murmur of Letta May's voice as she spoke to the animals during her early morning chores. She had insisted on maintaining their normal routine despite the crisis looming over them, approaching each task with the same careful attention she had always shown. If anything, the threat of separation had made her more present in each moment, as if she were storing up memories against the long emptiness to come. When Eli joined her in the barn, he found her braiding colorful scraps of fabric into gritas, made a decoration that served no practical purpose but somehow made the mare look festive despite the somber circumstances. Her hands moved with practiced skill, weaving together blues and yellows and deep reds in patterns that seemed to catch and hold the lamplight. She should look her best for whatever comes, Lita May explained without looking up from her work. Grandmother always said animals know when important things are happening, and they deserve to feel dignified during difficult times. The simple wisdom of it struck Eli as profound. Here was a child facing the destruction of everything she had found precious, yet her first thought was for the comfort and dignity of the creatures in her care. If Thomas Brennan couldn't see the extraordinary character his niece had developed, then he was either blind or willfully ignorant of what truly mattered in measuring a person's worth. "Jacob Stoltzfus wants to speak with you," Eli said as they moved through the morning feeding routine. "He asked if you'd come by his farm this afternoon. Said there was something important he needed to discuss before tomorrow." Lita May paused in her distribution of grain, studying his face with those disconcerting eyes that seemed to see far more than they should. Does he think there's something that can be done? Some way to change what's coming? I don't know. But Jacob's a practical man who doesn't waste time on empty gestures. If he wants to talk, it's because he has something meaningful to say. The visit to the Stoltzfus farm revealed an unexpected gathering. When they arrived in the early afternoon, they found not just Jacob and his family, but also Bishop Miller, Martha Byler, Benjamin King, and several other community elders. The group sat around the large kitchen table with the serious demeanor of people conducting important business, and their expressions carried a mixture of determination and barely controlled anger that surprised Eli with its intensity. "We've been talking," Jacob announced without preamble, gesturing for Eli and Lita May to take the empty chairs that had clearly been prepared for them, "about what's happening tomorrow and about what it means for our community to have a child, torn away from people who love her by strangers who see her only as property to be managed." Bishop Miller leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped tightly on the table's surface. "We've also been discussing the legal realities of the situation and what options might exist within the bounds of our faith and the laws of this country." "What kind of options?" Eli asked, though he tried to keep his hopes from rising too quickly. Martha Byler spoke up, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to organizing community action. "There are families in our church with connections in other states' cousins, and relatives who might be willing to provide temporary shelter for a child whose welfare was at risk. Pennsylvania isn't the only place where Amish communities exist." "You're talking about helping her run away again," Eli said slowly, trying to understand the implications of what they were suggesting. "We're talking about protecting a member of our community from those who would harm her," Benjamin King corrected, his tone firm but not argumentative. "That girl has brought nothing but good to this settlement. She's healed our animals, helped our children understand God's creation, and shown more Christian charity than many adults I know. If her own family can't see her value, then perhaps it's time for her to find a new family that can." The suggestion hung in the air like morning mist, substantial enough to feel but too delicate to grasp directly. Eli understood that these people, his friends and neighbors, were offering to risk their own standing with legal authorities to protect a child they had known for only 2 months. The generosity of it overwhelmed him, yet the practical difficulties seemed insurmountable. "Even if we could get her safely away from here," he said carefully,
She'd spend the rest of her childhood running from people with legal authority to find her.
That's no life for anyone, especially a young girl who's already suffered more displacement than any child should have to bear. Lita May had remained silent throughout the discussion, but now she looked up from the hands folded in her lap.
"There might be another way," she said quietly,
her voice carrying a strange quality that made everyone at the table turn toward her with sudden attention.
"What kind of way?"
Bishop Miller asked gently.
"My grandmother once told me about families who faced impossible choices, situations where the law and what was right pulled in different directions.
She said sometimes the only solution was to trust that God would provide a path that human wisdom couldn't see,
but only if people were willing to have faith in outcomes they couldn't control or predict."
The cryptic nature of her response frustrated Eli, yet something in her tone suggested she was working toward a point that might actually offer hope.
"What does that mean in practical terms?"
Lita May was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on something beyond the kitchen window, where the last autumn leaves clung stubbornly to the oak trees, despite the increasing wind. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of a decision that had been forming throughout their conversation.
"It means I need to face my uncle tomorrow, but not as the frightened child who ran away from his authority. I need to meet him as someone who has found her place in the world and won't be moved from it by threats or legal documents or family obligations that ignore who I've become."
"Lita May," Eli began, concern thick in his voice, "he has legal custody. The law is on his side, regardless of what we think is right." She turned to look at him directly, and for a moment he saw not the gentle girl who had become so precious to him, but someone older and more resolute than her years should have allowed. Sometimes the law can only go as far as a person's willingness to be governed by it. And sometimes, when everything else fails, the only thing left is to trust that God's justice is bigger than human courts. The implications of her words sent a chill through Eli's chest. She was talking about defiance, about refusing to cooperate with legal authority, even when the consequences might be severe. It was the kind of stand that could bring down serious trouble, not just on herself, but on everyone who had offered to help her. Yet as he looked around the table at the faces of his neighbors and friends, he saw the same resolution that marked Lita May's features. These people had made their choice. They would stand with her regardless of the cost, because sometimes protecting what was right mattered more than avoiding what was difficult. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Jacob said with quiet finality, "she won't face it alone. This community has claimed her as one of our own, and we protect our own." The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows with increasing intensity as afternoon faded toward evening. But inside the warm kitchen, surrounded by people who had chosen love over law and conviction over convenience, Eli felt something that had been missing since his family's death. The absolute certainty that he belonged to something larger and more powerful than his own individual struggle. Tomorrow would bring Thomas Brennan and his legal documents, his family authority, and his determination to reclaim property he had never bothered to understand. But it would also bring something he wasn't prepared for, community that had learned to recognize true family when they found it, and who were willing to fight for what they knew to be right, regardless of what the law might say about their chances of success. As they prepared to leave the Stoltzfus farm, Lita May paused to speak privately with Bishop Miller. Eli couldn't hear their conversation, but he saw the old man's expression shift from concern to surprise to something approaching awe as she spoke. When they finished, the bishop placed his hands on her shoulders in a gesture of blessing, his voice carrying clearly across the kitchen as he spoke. "May God grant you the strength to do what you believe is right, child, and may He protect all of us from the consequences of standing with you." That night, as they shared what might be their last quiet supper together, Eli found himself studying every detail of the moment. The way lamplight caught the gold threads in Lita May's hair, the comfortable silence that stretched between them,
the simple pleasure of shared food and mutual understanding. Tomorrow would bring challenges that might scatter everything they had built. But tonight there was still this, the peace that came from knowing they had found each other across the vast distances of grief and loss. And that whatever happened next, they would face it as family should together, and unafraid. Lita May's hands became the focal point of everything that mattered as she stood in the farmyard that Friday morning, her palms pressed together in prayer while Thomas Brennan's hired carriage approached through the November mist. Her healing hands, small, steady, and marked with the honest calluses of farm work, represented everything she had become during her months with Eli, and everything her uncle sought to change or eliminate entirely. The carriage was an impressive affair, black lacquered wood with brass fittings that gleamed even in the muted light, pulled by a matched pair of chestnut horses that spoke of money spent without concern for expense. It was the kind of conveyance that announced its owner's importance to anyone who might witness its passage, and Eli understood that this display of wealth was entirely deliberate, a reminder of the resources arrayed against them. Thomas Brennan emerged from the carriage with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to having his will accommodated without question. He was perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed in city clothes that looked foreign against the simple backdrop of the Amish farm, with the kind of soft prosperity that suggested a life spent in comfortable offices rather than honest labor. His eyes found Lita May immediately, and Eli caught the flicker of disapproval that crossed his features as he took in her plain Amish dress and the practical cap that covered her hair. "Lita May," Brennan said, his voice carrying the authority of blood and law. "You've led us quite a chase, young lady. Your aunt has been sick with worry about your welfare, wondering if you were safe or properly cared for." His gaze shifted to Eli with barely concealed disdain, though I can see now that her concerns were well-founded. Lita May stepped forward, her posture straight and her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Uncle Thomas, you look well. I trust Aunt Margaret and the children are in good health?" The formal politeness of her greeting seemed to surprise him. Clearly, he had expected to find the frightened, confused child who had fled from his authority months earlier, not this composed young woman who met his gaze without flinching. "They are well, though concerned about your disappearance. We've, come to take you home where you belong, with family who can provide proper care and guidance." Brennan's tone carried the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow child. "I've brought traveling clothes more appropriate than what you're wearing, and we can be back in Cincinnati by tomorrow evening if we leave within the hour." I'm home," Lita May replied simply. "I'm with family who provide exactly the care and guidance I need." The quiet certainty in her voice created a moment of tense silence, broken only by the restless stamping of the carriage horses and the distant sound of farm life continuing its normal rhythms. Brennan's expression shifted from confident authority to something approaching anger as he realized this wouldn't be the simple retrieval he had anticipated. "Don't be ridiculous, child. This man," he gestured dismissively toward Eli, "is a stranger who has taken advantage of your confused state to gain free labor for his farm. You have real family who can provide education, social position, and all the advantages befitting your inheritance." "My inheritance?" Lita May's voice carried a sharp edge that Eli had never heard before. "Is that what this is about? The money from Father's mill, the property in Youngstown? Because if that's your concern, Uncle Thomas, you're welcome to it. I never wanted any part of wealth that came from my parents' deaths." Brennan's face flushed with embarrassment or anger, perhaps both. "That's enough of this dramatic nonsense. You're a child who doesn't understand the complexities of adult responsibilities. I have legal custody, and you will come with me, whether you like it or not." He signaled to the carriage driver, who climbed down with the resigned expression of a man accustomed to unpleasant tasks. But before either could move toward Lita May, Jacob Stoltzfus emerged from the barn where he had been waiting with several other community members. His presence alone would have been significant, but he was followed by Bishop Miller, Martha Byler, Benjamin King, and nearly a dozen other Amish adults who formed a loose circle around the farmyard. "Mr. Brennan," Jacob said with the careful courtesy that marked Amish interactions with outsiders. "I'm Jacob Stoltzfus, Eli's neighbor and friend. We'd like to speak with you about your niece's situation before any decisions are made that can't be undone." Brennan looked around at the gathering with growing irritation. "This is a family matter that doesn't concern your community. I have legal authority over my niece's welfare, and I don't require permission from strangers to exercise that authority." Bishop Miller stepped forward, his weathered face calm but determined. "With respect, sir, Lita May became part of our community the moment she chose to stay among us. We take the welfare of our people seriously, and we've seen enough to know that your niece has found healing and purpose here that she might not find elsewhere." "Healing?" Brennan's laugh held no humor. "Is that what you call encouraging her? Dangerous delusions about miraculous powers. I've heard the reports about her supposed healing abilities, and I can assure you that such fantasies will be properly addressed once she's returned to appropriate medical supervision." The words fell into the farmyard like stones into still water, creating ripples of tension that spread through the assembled community. Eli felt his own anger rise at the casual dismissal of gifts that had brought nothing but good to everyone who witnessed them, but it was Lita May who responded with quiet steel in her voice. "There are no delusions, Uncle Thomas. The healing is real, whether you choose to believe in it or not. And I won't allow you or any doctor to convince me that God's gifts are symptoms of illness that need to be cured." She raised her hands, palms forward, and Eli watched as they began to emit the same soft golden light he had first witnessed during Guida's healing weeks earlier. The glow was gentle but unmistakable, visible even in the daylight, and the horses hitched to Brennan's carriage nickered softly as if recognizing something that spoke to their deepest understanding of the natural world. Brennan stared at his niece's glowing hands with an expression that cycled rapidly through disbelief, fear, and revulsion. "Stop that immediately," he commanded, his voice rising with panic. "Whatever trick you're using, whatever method of deception, it's not deception," Lita May said quietly, lowering her hands as the light faded. "It's who I am, Uncle Thomas. It's who I've always been, and who I'll continue to be regardless of what you or anyone else thinks about it." The carriage driver had backed away from the scene, his face pale with superstitious fear, and even Brennan seemed shaken by what he had witnessed. But his recovery was swift, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the hard edge of someone whose authority had been challenged once too often. "All the more reason for you to come home immediately. These people have obviously encouraged your tendencies ... instead of helping you overcome them. You need proper guidance from people who understand the dangers of such displays." "The only danger," said a new voice from the edge of the farmyard, "is in trying to suppress gifts that God has given for the healing of His creation." Everyone turned to see Dr. Samuel Morrison approaching on foot, his medical bag in hand and his expression grave but determined. The local physician was an Englishman who had served the community for nearly 20 years, earning respect from both Amish and non-Amish residents through his skill and compassion. His presence lent immediate weight to whatever he was about to say. "Dr. Morrison," Eli said, surprised by the man's unexpected appearance, "what brings you here?" "I came because Martha Byler sent word about what was happening today," Morrison replied, his gaze moving between Brennan and Lita May. "I've witnessed this young lady's healing abilities on several occasions, and I felt it was important to offer my professional opinion about their nature and value." Brennan drew himself up with renewed confidence. Finally, someone with medical training. "Doctor," I'm sure you'll agree that these supposed healing abilities are either fraudulent or symptomatic of a serious psychological condition that requires immediate treatment. Morrison's response was not what Brennan expected. On the contrary, sir. I've seen Lita May heal injuries and illnesses that conventional medicine could not address. Her abilities are genuine, beneficial, and entirely consistent with what I would expect from divine intervention in the natural order. Any attempt to suppress or treat such gifts would be not only misguided but actively harmful to both the child and the community she serves. The doctor's professional endorsement of Lita May's abilities created a moment of stunned silence. Here was an educated medical practitioner, a man of science and rational thought, declaring publicly that the gifts Brennan sought to eliminate were not only real but valuable beyond measure. The new horseshoe gleamed bright silver in the forge fire as Benjamin King worked the bellows, shaping fresh iron while the confrontation reached its crucial moment in the farmyard beyond. The rhythmic hammering had drawn Thomas Brennan's attention, and the sight of the blacksmith at his work seemed to crystallize something in his understanding of what his niece had found among these people: honest labor, genuine purpose, and the kind of belonging that money couldn't purchase. Dr. Morrison's endorsement had visibly shaken Brennan's confidence, but he rallied with the determination of a man who had built his life on controlling outcomes through force of will and superior resources. Doctor, I appreciate your interesting perspective on these matters, but I have consulted with medical professionals in Cincinnati who take a very different view of such phenomena. My niece requires proper psychological evaluation, not encouragement in potentially dangerous delusions. Dangerous? Morrison's voice carried the sharp edge of professional indignation. Sir, I have personally witnessed this young lady heal a bull that should have died from its injuries, restore a lame horse to perfect soundness, and ease the suffering of countless farm animals throughout this community. If you consider compassionate healing to be dangerous, then I question your understanding of both medicine and morality. Lita May stepped between the two men, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had been growing throughout the confrontation. Uncle Thomas, Dr. Morrison speaks the truth about my abilities, but that's not really what this is about, is it? You're not here because you're concerned about my welfare or my future. You're here because having a niece with unexplained powers embarrasses you in front of your business associates and social circle. Brennan's face flushed with angry denial, but Lita May continued before he could speak. You want to take me back to Cincinnati so you can hide me away, convince everyone that the stories about my healing are just rural superstition, and eventually persuade me that my gifts are either imagination or illness. You want me to become the kind of proper young lady who will reflect well on your family's reputation. That's not, Brennan began, but she held up one hand to stop him. It is exactly that. You offered to send me to doctors who specialize in treating children with unusual behaviors. You want to cure me of being who I am, Uncle Thomas, and I won't allow that to happen. The truth of her words hung in the air like the ringing of hammer on anvil from Benjamin's forge. Around the farmyard, the assembled community members watched with the quiet intensity of people witnessing a moment that would define everything that followed. Brennan's response revealed the depth of his frustration and fear. You don't understand. The world beyond this isolated community, Lita May. There are people who would exploit your abilities, others who would consider them evidence of witchcraft or demonic influence. I'm trying to protect you from forces you can't possibly comprehend by destroying the very thing you claim to be protecting. Eli spoke for the first time since Brennan's arrival, his voice carrying decades of hard-earned wisdom. You want to keep her safe by convincing her that her greatest gift is actually a curse. That's not protection, that's imprisonment. Jacob Stoltzfus moved closer to stand beside Eli, his presence adding weight to the words. We've seen what she becomes when her gifts are accepted and valued. She flourishes here, grows in confidence and purpose. What you're proposing would crush that growth and leave her diminished. Brennan looked around at the circle of faces surrounding him, seeing for the first time the unified determination that his arrival had awakened. These people weren't simply defending a child they happened to like. They were protecting something they recognized as precious and irreplaceable. "This is absurd," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I have legal custody. Whatever you think about her welfare, the law is clear about my authority in this matter." Bishop Miller stepped forward, his weathered hands clasped behind his back and his expression grave but resolute. "Mr. Brennan, our community has faced legal challenges before when we believed fundamental principles were at stake. We understand the power of courts and official documents, but we also understand that some things matter more than legal convenience. Are you threatening me?" Brennan's voice rose with genuine alarm. "We're informing you," Bishop Miller replied with unshakable calm. "If you attempt to take this child against her will, you'll find that our community is prepared to make that process as difficult and publicly visible as possible. We have connections in other states, resources you might not expect, and the kind of stubborn persistence that has kept our way of life intact for generations." The threat was delivered with such quiet dignity that it took a moment for its full implications to register. Brennan stared at the bishop, clearly realizing that he was facing not just individual resistance, but the organized opposition of an entire community that had decided to make Lida May's welfare their collective responsibility. From the forge came the final ringing strokes as Benjamin completed his work on the new horseshoe. The blacksmith emerged carrying the finished piece on long tongs, its surface glowing orange-hot against the gray November sky. He approached the group with the measured pace of someone accustomed to working with dangerous forces that required respect and careful handling. "Shoes for the mare," Benjamin announced, holding up the horseshoe for everyone to see. "Fresh iron, properly shaped, ready to carry her wherever she needs to go." His gaze moved meaningfully between Lida May and her uncle. "Sometimes the old shoes wear out or don't fit anymore. When that happens, you don't try to force them back on. You make new ones that suit the horse as she is now, not as she used to be." The metaphor was unmistakable, and Brennan's expression showed that he understood its application to his current situation. He was trying to force his niece back into a life that no longer fit who she had become, expecting her to accept limitations that would cripple her development and deny her true nature. Lida May moved to touch the still warm horseshoe, her fingers trailing along its curved surface without flinching from the heat. The iron seemed to respond to her touch, cooling more rapidly than natural physics should have allowed, and when she stepped back, it gleamed like polished silver in the gray light. "This is who I am, Uncle Thomas," she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "I can touch hot iron and cool it with my hands. I can heal injuries that doctors say are permanent. I can ease suffering in ways that don't depend on medicines or surgery. These aren't delusions or tricks. They're gifts that God has given me to serve His creation." She looked directly into his eyes, her expression combining the love of a niece with the steel of someone who had found her true calling. "You can try to take me back to Cincinnati by force, but you can't make me pretend to be someone I'm not. And you can't undo what I've discovered about myself and where I belong." Brennan stared at the cooling horseshoe, then at his niece's calm face, then at the circle of determined adults who had claimed her as their own. For the first time since his arrival, he seemed to truly understand the magnitude of what he was, attempting to change not just a child's living situation, but her entire sense of identity and purpose. The November wind stirred the dry leaves around their feet, carrying the sense of approaching winter and the promise of seasons yet to come. In that moment of suspended decision, everything balanced on the edge of transformation, waiting to see whether love or law would prove stronger, whether community bonds could overcome the claims of blood and legal authority. The new horseshoe cooled in Benjamin's steady hands, ready to protect and support whatever journey lay ahead. The shared supper table in the Yoder farmhouse had been extended with boards and sawhorses to accommodate the gathering that filled the kitchen on the evening after Thomas Brennan's departure. Where once Eli had eaten alone in echoing silence, now voices mingled in warm conversation, as neighbors shared the meal that had become their celebration of what community could accomplish when love overcame law. 3 months had passed since that November confrontation, and the winter had proved gentler than anyone expected, both in weather and in the adjustments that followed. Brennan's reluctant acceptance of his niece's choice. The legal documents lay safely stored in Bishop Miller's keeping, signed papers that formally transferred guardianship from uncle to community, with Eli named as Lida May's official guardian until she reached majority. It had taken lawyers, judges, and considerable pressure from Dr. Morrison's professional testimony. But in the end, even the courts had recognized that a child's welfare sometimes required unconventional solutions. "The mare's foal will come early," Lida May announced as she passed a bowl of mashed turnips to young Daniel Stoltzfus, who had become a permanent fixture at their supper table. "Greta's been showing signs all week, and I think we'll have a new addition to the family before month's end." Jacob Stoltzfus looked up from carving the roast chicken, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "A foal born in late winter usually means a strong constitution. Something about surviving the cold season while still growing makes them hardy as bedrock." The observation sparked a general discussion about the qualities that develop in creatures who face challenges early in life. And Eli found himself watching Lida May's animated participation with the deep satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a transformation beyond his ability to have imagined. The thin, desperate child who had appeared at his gate had become a confident young woman whose opinions were sought and valued by adults with decades more experience. Her healing gifts had found their proper place within the community's understanding of divine grace. She no longer hid her abilities or apologized for their existence, but neither did she use them carelessly or for personal gain. When the Kaufman family's milk cow had developed a serious infection, Lida May had worked alongside Dr. Morrison, combining her healing touch with his medical knowledge to achieve results neither could have managed alone. When old Wilhelm Byler had suffered a stroke that left him unable to speak clearly, her gentle ministrations had restored enough function for him to communicate his needs and preferences to his worried family. "She's become what her grandmother always hoped she would be," Martha Byler had confided to Eli after witnessing Lida May's careful treatment of a child's broken arm. "Someone who uses her gifts in service to others rather than for personal glory or gain. That kind of wisdom usually takes decades to develop." The legal victory over Thomas Brennan had cost them all something in anxiety and effort, but it had also proven that communities could successfully challenge authority when fundamental principles were at stake. The story had spread throughout the network of Amish settlements, inspiring other groups to stand firm when outside pressures threatened their values or their people. Brennan himself had surprised everyone with his final gesture before departing for Cincinnati. Instead of the anger or resentment they had expected, he had left behind a letter for his niece that acknowledged both his mistakes and his genuine concern for her welfare. Along with the letter had come legal documents transferring her inheritance into a trust that she could access when she reached adulthood, but with no strings attached regarding how she chose to live her life. "He wasn't evil," Lida May had said after reading his farewell message. "Just frightened of things he couldn't understand or control. Maybe someday he'll visit and see what I've become in a place where my gifts are valued instead of feared." Tonight's gathering represented the kind of extended family that had grown around their original bond. Jacob and his family, Bishop Miller, and his wife, Martha Byler, with her younger children, Benjamin King, and several other neighbors who had become regular participants in their weekly shared meals. What had begun as an act of charity toward a hungry child had evolved into something that enriched everyone who participated. "Tell us about the new families coming in spring," Bishop Miller requested as they moved toward the evening's conclusion. "I understand we'll have 3 households joining us from Ohio?" The conversation turned to community business new members, shared projects, the planning that sustained their way of life across generations. Eli listened with the contentment of someone who had found his place not just as an individual, but as part of something larger and more enduring than personal concerns. As the evening wound down and neighbors began their journeys home, Eli and Lena May worked together to clean the extended table and restore the kitchen to its normal proportions. Their movements carried the comfortable efficiency of people who had shared this routine countless times, who understood each other's patterns and preferences without need for discussion. "Are you happy?" Eli asked as they finished wiping down the last of the dishes, the question emerging from depths he hadn't realized he was exploring. Lena May considered the inquiry with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "I'm more than happy. I'm home, in every sense that word can mean. I have family who love me for who I am, work that uses my gifts in meaningful ways, and a community that values what I bring to it. What more could anyone ask for?" She moved to the window and looked out at the farmyard, where the barn stood solid against the winter night, its walls sheltering the animals that had become as dear to her as any human companions. "Sometimes I think about the path that brought me here, all the losses and wandering and uncertainty that had to happen before I could find this place. It seems impossible that so much pain could lead to so much joy, but maybe that's how healing works. Maybe we have to be broken before we can truly appreciate being whole." Ayla joined her at the window, studying the familiar landscape that had been transformed by her presence, from a place of survival into a home filled with purpose and love. "Your grandmother would be proud of what you've become, and your family would be proud of the father you've become to me." She leaned against his shoulder with the easy affection that had developed between them. "We found each other across impossible distances of grief and loss. That has to be more than coincidence." Outside, the winter stars shone with the brilliant clarity that came only on the coldest nights, their light undimmed by the darkness that surrounded them. Inside the warm kitchen, the table stood ready for tomorrow's meals, its surface bearing the gentle scars and worn places that spoke of daily use and shared nourishment. The dried wildflower bouquet still hung from the rafters, its colors now completely faded to variations of brown and gold, but somehow more beautiful in its winter incarnation than it had been in autumn's glory. Like their own relationship, it had survived the dying of its original form to become something altogether different, fragile perhaps, but possessed of an endurance that fresh beauty could never match. "Tomorrow there will be new challenges," Eli said quietly, speaking the comfortable truth that sustained all farming families through the seasons of uncertainty and change. "Tomorrow there will be new possibilities," Lena May corrected gently, her voice carrying the unshakable optimism that had become her signature response to whatever difficulties arose. They stood together in the lamplight, father and daughter, by choice rather than blood, their shared silence filled with gratitude for the grace that had brought them together, and the love that would sustain them through whatever seasons lay ahead. Outside, the winter wind stirred the bare branches with promises of spring's eventual return, but inside their home remained warm and steady, sheltered by more than stone and timber. The supper table waited in the darkness, ready to gather them again tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that.